Hi everyone, it's Bryony Lieber here from Bryony Lieber Coaching. I'm preparing this video for you today on thinking preference assessments and sending it to you because you've either recently done your thinking preference assessment or you're one of the people who won the opportunity to do your assessment for free. So thank you for taking your time to have a look at this video. I'm hoping it won't be too long, and I hope it will give you enough insight into your specific assessment report to decide whether you want to go further and perhaps book a coaching session with me or attend one of my workshops on the thinking preferences, or otherwise help you in just understanding your report. So let's jump into it. Right, so the first thing I want you to know is that your brain controls what you do, but you can control your brain. Now, your brain is about a 1.5 kilogram organ in your body, and it is pivotal to survival, to thinking, to breathing, to walking, to moving, to analyzing information, communication, etc. And every day we make many thousands of decisions. Now, if we had to consciously think about every single one of those decisions every single day, we would be exhausted, because our brains, when we are processing information and thinking and just surviving, uses approximately 30% of our energy. So if you're in thinking conscious mode the whole time, you would be absolutely finished by the time we've kind of got to breakfast. So as a result of that, our brains automate processes for us so that they can become unconscious behaviors that we don't have to think about. So for instance, when we're learning something new, it takes time to actually learn that process, and it takes energy because we're having to think about it. But as that process becomes something that we are very familiar with, we start to turn that into an unconscious behavior and an unconscious action that we take. And that's how habits are created. That's how doing the work that we do, that we don't have to think about, takes place. And it frees up time and energy for us to be conscious in other areas of our life. So why am I telling you this? Well, because your thinking preferences are one of those unconscious things that our brains have automated for us so that we can get on and be conscious about other things. So that's the first point that I wanted to make. Second point is that we get caught in thinking traps. And if we don't understand those thinking traps or those assumptions that we make, we very easily get caught in them. And when we're communicating, we very easily disconnect from each other and understand because of these assumptions. So there are 5 thinking traps that people typically fall into. And the first one is that everybody thinks like me. So because I like to communicate with lots of words, and I ask people how they're doing, and I like to make people feel comfortable, and I want to make sure that all the right people are in the room when we're talking about something, I assume that everybody else likes to do the same. But there are some people who just want to get on with the facts and make a decision and do things very quickly. And they are driven by facts and information, whereas I am driven by connection and understanding and consensus. And so if I assume that everybody is driven by the same things as me, I may find that I annoy certain people because I take a long time to explain things. And I also find that I am intimidated by people who perhaps think differently to me, because that shows up in their behavior in different ways. So when we assume that everybody thinks like us, we take away the opportunity to understand that things may be done in different ways, and we often put up blocks when things are done in a way that we don't understand. The other one that I want to talk about is that fear shuts down connection and empathy. Now, fear arises in communication, in leadership, in how we manage, because of differences and because of misunderstanding. So when you have various different thinking preferences represented in the room, if they all only speak from their own preference, miscommunication is going to arise, firstly, quite easily. When we miscommunicate or misunderstand each other, it can create a feeling of being threatened or being fearful. And when we feel fearful or anxious or threatened, our brains immediately go into survival mode. So fight, flight, or freeze. Now, it's not really necessary to be in fight, flight, or freeze when you're having a normal conversation, but our brains go into that mode as a survival mechanism. And it's just part of how we're wired. So what you want to be able to do is have conversations and engage with people in a way that's non-threatening. And to understand other people's thinking preferences is the easiest way to step into their way of thinking so that you can communicate in a non-threatening way. Third point that I want to make is really a combination of number 4 and 5. And that is that we all have this internal dialogue going on in our heads all the time that creates this noise. And it's our internal critic, and it's all of our assumptions and beliefs and our kind of unconscious biases. And it creates this noise through which we filter everything. And so when we assume that the words that have come out my mouth that I understand will land within you in the same way as I understood them, we're making a big mistake, because how I understand what you say is filtered through all of my internal chatter. And what you say might not be what I understand. So your intention in your communication might not be the impact that I experience. And as a result, just because you say it in a particular way with a certain intention or meaning doesn't necessarily mean that I understand it in the way that you intended. And that in itself is an opportunity for people to misunderstand and disconnect. And when we disconnect, we go into a mini fight, flight, or freeze mode, and we're immediately triggered into survival, which is really, it's a stressful state to be in. Okay, there we go. Okay, so to sum it all up, basically what I'm saying is that we all think through our own particular lens, which means we all see the world in a different way, we all behave in different ways, and we perceive others on the basis of our particular lens of the world. And so I've always loved this image of 5 or 6 people looking at an elephant through their own particular lens and all describing something completely different. And so if you imagine you're in a conversation with these 6 people and you're all talking from your own perspective, the entire conversation is going to make absolutely no sense whatsoever. And the impact of that conversation is that everybody leaves it feeling confused, in disagreement with each other, and possibly feeling quite angry or anxious or disengaged from the conversation. So to pull this all together, we all tend to prefer communicating from our own thinking preference because that is the unconscious way in which we communicate, because it's the easiest way for us to communicate. But we also expect everybody else to communicate in our own preferred style too. And so if we're all expecting each other to do things the way that we do things, we often tend to end up in confusion and anxiety and miscommunication, and really kind of negatively impacting on our ability to be effective. So this is why I really like the Nettling Brain Institute Thinking Preference Assessment, because it gives us a tool through which we can develop. When we can understand our own preferences and understand that other people have their own preferences, that you can't pass or fail a thinking preference. You are what you are, you have what you have. None is right or wrong, they're just different. Then it opens up the opportunity to be curious about people and curious about other people's way of seeing the world and experiencing the world, and what drives their particular behaviors and their communication style. So please note, you can't pass or fail your assessment. There is no right or wrong thinking preference. There is no good or bad. Each of them is what they are. Your assessment reflects a thinking preference, not a skill. So you can have a very strong thinking preference, but not necessarily have a skill in that quadrant, because you haven't had the opportunity to explore that quadrant in the work that you do, in the organization that you work in, etc. You can also have a very strong skill, so you can be working with figures all the time, but not particularly enjoy that. That might reflect that you don't have a strong thinking preference, but for whatever reason, you found yourself working in a particular area because you're good at it. I think it's really important to note that just because you're good at something doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to love doing what you're doing. And just because you have a particular preference for something doesn't mean that you might be good at it. You can develop the skills. You don't necessarily change your preference though. So everybody has elements of each quadrant. Most of us have a distinct preference in one or two of the quadrants. And our preferences are, by and large, fully created by the time we're in our early teens. So they are created through our exposure to various things, the organizations in which we grow up, the cultures and the feedback in which we grow up. And our preferences can change, and they certainly strengthen and grow as we develop through our teenage years and into our early adult years. But they tend not to change dramatically unless there's a very strong motivation for them to change. So working in a completely new context, in a completely different environment, a significant event taking place in your life, something perhaps quite traumatic, or a big career change into a completely different environment, that may trigger a change in your thinking preference. But if you don't have any particular kind of strong motivation to change, it's probably not going to change. And I want to go back to the point that this is a developmental tool. So when you see your assessment report and you see yourself in a particular quadrant, it doesn't mean that you should use that quadrant as an excuse to only ever think from that particular lens, or act or communicate or engage from that particular lens, but rather that there's opportunity to step into the other quadrants when the need arises, when you're in the right context to do so, or when you are speaking to people and engaging with people who are in different quadrants to you. So think of it as a developmental tool rather than something that pigeonholes you into a particular quadrant. Okay, so very quickly going over the 4 quadrants, we have L1, R1, which are your top 2 quadrants, and L2, R2, which are your bottom 2 quadrants, and you can see them as left or right quadrants. So that's just familiarizing you with the terminology, and I'm going to go through them in a little bit more detail. I'm trying to change the slide, but it is not. There we go. Okay. So this is a very busy slide, and you might want to pause the video for a moment just so that you can take time to familiarize yourself. So if you want to pause now, go for it, and then go back onto play when you're ready. Okay, so now that you've come back, let me help you familiarize as well. So these two top quadrants, the L1 and the R1, are the quadrants that preference thinking over doing. Okay, so they are more in their head than they are in action and in their hands. These two, the L2 and the R2, are more preference towards action and doing than getting caught up in their thinking and in their heads. Okay, then the two left quadrants, preference facts and analysis and data and processes over what the two right quadrants preference, which is possibilities of the future, considerations around people, their emotions and their connectedness, and intuition. So the two right-hand quadrants put a lot of preference into reading the room and reading people's body language and understanding what's going on the basis of a gut feeling, as opposed to data and science and facts, which is where the two left-hand quadrants put more emphasis. Now, if you look at the polar opposites of each other, so the L1 and the R2, they are polar opposites of each other. And if you imagine an elastic band kind of being stretched like this, the stronger those two opposing quadrants are, the greater the tension. And so, for instance, if you have a look at them, the L1 preferences facts and data and can come across as being quite clinical. And they prefer data over emotions. Whereas the R2 is more preference towards connectedness and intuition and feelings and how this might affect people. And they are more energized by emotions. So that shows up in these two people's behaviors and in their communication styles, and can often cause great tension in communication if both stay only within their particular preference. When they cross over into each other's preferences, that's where the connection starts to happen. In the same way, the R1 and the L2 are polar opposites of each other. And again, if you imagine an elastic band pulling away from each other, the stronger those preferences are, the stronger the tension and the stronger the opportunity for misunderstanding on the basis of how one understands through one's lens. So the R1, for instance, puts a lot of stock in alternative ways of doing things and change and taking risks and being more focused on where things could go. Whereas the L2 has a preference for understanding how things have been in the past and what the processes and rules and systems are and how those might apply to where we are. And the R1 from an L2 perspective can look risky, whereas the L2 from the R1's perspective can look quite boring because they do what they've always done in the perception of the R1. So I think you can start to see from this that if we stay stuck in our particular thinking preferences, there's an opportunity to misunderstand each other incredibly quickly and to make the assumptions that the other person is wrong, not as good as, maybe not as effective as our particular preference. And the moment we get caught up in judgment is when we stop understanding and connecting with each other. So this is really an important tool to use to create connection, because it creates the opportunity for us to understand other ways of doing things, other ways of seeing things, other ways of communicating and understanding. This slide gives us some insights into how we perceive each other from our different lenses. So in each of these quadrants, we talk around how a particular person shows up because of their style, and how they can be perceived from somebody from a different thinking preference. So for instance, because of their style, the L1 quadrant can show up as rational, as thorough, as precise, as authoritative, because they are quick to make a decision based on facts, and as logical. But they can be perceived and experienced by somebody from, say, for instance, the R2 quadrant as being rigid and ruthless because they value facts over people. They can be experienced as being quite clinical and impersonal because they use short sentences and get to the point very quickly and want to start the meeting without spending time getting to know people. Now, the opposite of the L1 is the R2. And because of their style, the R2 shows up as caring, as friendly, emotional, sociable, and empathetic. But they can be perceived by somebody, for instance, from the L1 quadrant as being overly sensitive, as being too talkative because they use their hands a lot, like I do. And they ask people how they are, and they'll spend time kind of relating to each other before they get to the business of the meeting. And so they can also often be perceived by their opposite thinking style as unbusinesslike. Now, when you have two people in a room, one who thinks the other is impersonal, and one who thinks that the person is unbusinesslike, you immediately have a recipe for not understanding each other and not having an effective conversation. And then because of their style, the R1 shows up as imaginative and adventurous and maybe risk-taking and a bit experimental and sometimes quite daydreamy, and kind of caught up in the concepts as opposed to the detail and the process. And as a result, can be perceived by people from an L1 and an L2 preference as perhaps being unfocused, being impulsive, going off at a tangent when they start talking about different alternatives, and maybe even being vague and a bit scattered. To the R1, the L2 can look very controlling and nitpicky and quite boring, to be honest, because as a result of their style, they show up as people who are careful and methodical and procedural and who want to understand how something has been done in the past before they apply something new. So if you go through this slide in your own time and start to think about situations where you've misunderstood somebody, it might be worth starting to think about, are they showing up in their style because of their thinking preference, and the misunderstanding is because you may have different thinking preferences and you may be interpreting through your own particular lens. And look around at your peers, look around at your partner, your children, people that you work with, and start to get a sense of how miscommunications and misunderstandings might arise as a result of how we behave through our particular thinking preferences. So just to recap, we care about all of this because if we get caught in the trap of thinking that the meaning arises from my words as opposed to the meaning arising from how you understand me, then I put stock in what's important to me as opposed to how you might understand me. And it reduces my ability to get through to you, to inspire you, to negotiate with you, to sell a concept to you. And essentially in life, we are all salespeople. we are all trying to sell a concept to somebody. We're trying to negotiate or influence or get somebody to do the work or pick up their socks or come to the dinner table or clean the dishes. And if we can communicate in the language of the person that we're trying to communicate with, we have a much better chance of being understood and of us staying out of the survival mode of fight, flight, or freeze and staying in the executive decision-making mode where we can be rational and logical and understand each other, as opposed to being reactive. So the whole objective behind this is actually being able to use your whole brain rather than just staying stuck in your particular preference. So being more conscious about your context and who you're communicating with than being automated in your own thinking preference. And the crux of all of this is, if you want to connect and be understood, you have to be willing to visit other areas of your brain rather than using your thinking preference as your excuse to be and to communicate in the way that is easiest for you. So I want to jump over to what a thinking preference report looks like. And most of you probably would have received a report either in this format or in this format, okay? I'm going to talk you through this format because this is the most recent format for presenting these reports. And so hopefully most of you have received it like this. On the front cover, you will have your name. So I've done this as anonymous. And you will see the type of assessment that's been done. So this is the NBI Adult, which almost all of you will have seen. There are different assessments that you can do, and if you're interested in those, just let me know. On the second page, you have your four-quadrant brain profile. So what you will see in this particular profile is that this person has dominant preferences for the R1 and R2 quadrants. And in fact, a very strong preference and a strong preference for R1 and R2 respectively. And then an average preference for the L2 quadrant and a very low preference for the L1 quadrant. And if you go across to the next page, you will see the scale on which these numbers are based, okay? If I go back to the previous page, you also see these numbers, so the slightly smaller numbers in a bracket. They are the sum of the two numbers on either side of them. And they really are useful when you have slightly less distinct preferences than this. Okay, here we are absolutely in no doubt that this person is very strongly R1 and R2 preference, but often it's possible that the preferences aren't as distinctly strong as this. Okay, so page 4 takes you through the general information regarding to the different quadrants, and page 5 has your candidate-specific information. So it's really useful to read both of page 4 and page 5 in detail, and to recognize that the quadrants assessment is really an evaluation of your preferences. And if you remember the assessment that you did, you were tasked with ranking 4 statements in order of preference, okay? So there may be certain processes associated with a particular quadrant that don't resonate with you. You need to look at all of the statements in total to recognize that you have a dominant preference rather than sticking with one particular process or statement. And so this is why page 6 is quite useful. This lists all of the questions where you ranked the statement of your dominant preference. And so you can go through this, and if these really hold true for you, then you know that you've responded to this in a way that's pretty accurate for you. Okay, and then you'll remember in your assessment, you did a second part to the assessment, which was a ranking of paired statements. And the paired statements relate to the two segments that each of the quadrants is broken up into. So the two segments for L1 relate to the realist and the analyst. And in this assessment, you can see that the person has a dominance towards the realist as opposed to the analyst. Now, the difference between the realist and the analyst is that the realist tends to be more pragmatic, takes facts and acts on them faster than the analyst does, who tends to preference more analysis and more research and more detail. Then in the L2, the difference between the stalwart preserver and the organizer is that the stalwart preserver tends to put a lot of stock in the past and in evidence and feels safe knowing that something's been done before and it's tried and tested. Whereas the organizer puts more emphasis on processes and systems and being ordered. So things like to-do lists and checking things off in a particular order is more their preference. The R1's two segments relate to the strategist and the Imagineer. And in this assessment, this person is pretty much equal in relation to those two. The strategist tends to look to the future in relation to strategies and trends and application of concepts into applied processes, whereas the Imagineer can tend to get caught up more in concepts and daydreaming and thoughts and not necessarily take that into an applied process. The one that I really want to highlight, though, is the segments that relate to the R2, because quite often people who are strongly dominant as an R2 are confused by the thought that this might indicate that they are highly extrovert. Now, this quadrant is divided into two segments, the socializer and the empathizer, and this distinguishes around extroversion and introversion. Anybody who is strong in this quadrant cares for people, is interested in people, in emotions, in how they feel and how they come together, and is probably quite strongly intuitive. But the big difference is that the socializer is highly energized by people and tends to prefer being with people and lots of people, whereas the empathizer cares deeply for people and preferences people in his or her decision making, but doesn't necessarily feel energized by being around people all the time. So they will care very deeply for how they feel, but they might be more comfortable being at home on their own, researching people, or in a small group, having more intimate one-on-one conversations, as opposed to the socializer who is preference towards large gatherings and high energy gatherings. And so that's a very important distinction to make, because it's often an area where people get confused and say, no, I'm definitely not a strong R2. I don't like spending time with lots of people. It's less about that and more about how people are part of your decision-making framework. Okay, and then the final page really has generic information relating to each of those segments. Right, so I'm back. I hope in these last 30 minutes, I've been able to give you some better insights into what the thinking preferences are around, what is in your report, so give you a little bit of an overview of how to read your report, and some ideas on how you might be able to apply your particular thinking preference in relation to the world in which you operate. I really would like that one of the key take-home messages for you is that just because you have a particular thinking preference doesn't mean that you need to use that as a crutch, but rather that it opens up a world of opportunities for you to explore, firstly, understanding what energizes you and how that relates to what you're doing right now. So if you find yourself not feeling energized in the work that you do, an indication might be that it is work that you're skilled in, but it's not necessarily aligned with your preferred way of doing things. Or that you are working in an area that is aligned with your preferred way of doing things, but perhaps you haven't developed the skill yet. It also might be an indicator that you are working with people who are very different thinking preferences to you, and that the issue that crops up is misunderstanding of each other through speaking through your own lens, rather than speaking to the lens of somebody else, or vice versa. And most importantly, that when you are skilled in adopting a whole brain approach of communication, of engagement, of managing and leading, that's when you are most impactful. If you stay stuck in one particular thinking preference, that is when your chances of being impactful are reduced, because life and the world and people we work with and the context we find ourselves in are a representation of all of the different thinking preferences. And so to stay stuck in one preference keeps us very limited to impacting only in that preference. And it creates the opportunity for us to disengage and to get caught up in survival mode of flight, fight or freeze, as opposed to in connection and in rational and logical approaches to decision making. So that's the end of this video. If you want to take this further, you're very welcome to contact me. I do from time to time run a workshop on the thinking preferences, and that goes into a lot more detail of each of the quadrants, as well as tools that you can use to step into other quadrants and indicators for how to read and develop clues around who you're speaking to. And I also do one-on-one coaching that could help you to use your thinking preference and apply it specifically in your life, in your career choices, in relation to how you're managing and leading, in relation to how you communicate. So I'd love some feedback. If this has been useful to you, please let me know. And if you would like more information, as I say, drop me an email, give me a phone call, connect with me on social media. And yeah, go and look for ways to speak the language of your listener. Thanks for watching, and see you again soon. Cheers.